Hi folks, I think we're going to get started as soon as Brian finds his way in. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ashok Mathur. This is the UCCAC space, the Centre for Innovation and Culture and the Arts in Canada. We used to be across the hall, and with the wisdom of universities, they decided to move a lot of things around. So we're kind of starting from scratch. This used to be an old lighting studio. Now we're in here, and we've turned off the lights so we don't all burn up in here. So I hope it's okay. And thank you all for coming. A couple of other thank yous. I want to acknowledge all the work that Emma did to Emma Barassa for getting all the people out, and for Gail as well. Gail's right there for doing work, and the True Equity Committee and the Status of Women Committee for sponsoring this. I also want to acknowledge the land we're on, Shwapnik territory. It's very important for us to know where we are and where we're situated. So as much as I appreciate the university for housing us here, I very much appreciate First Peoples of this land for the interchanges that are occurring. Thank you very much. I'm going to introduce briefly our two guests for the session on radical pedagogies. We have with us Aruna Srivastava from Calgary and Norman Cornett from Montreal. I won't say too much about them. Many of you have seen the film that Alanis Abamsalan had done on the kind of practice and pedagogy of Norman. And so I won't say too much more about that, except he might talk a bit about the dialogic styles that he uses and the practices he goes through. And the type of teaching he's doing and why it's important. And I think that's a question that many of us are going to be trying to address in this forum. Why do we do what we do, or how do we do what we do? What do we need to do when we're doing it? And our other guest is Aruna Srivastava. Aruna has taught at Calgary for over 2 decades now, and a very, very strong history in radical pedagogy, feminist pedagogy, critical pedagogy, race pedagogy, and she's doing a lot of work now on questions of reconciliation, and she's cross-posted to Indigenous studies. And I've learned a lot from Aruna over those years as well, and I very much appreciate that time. And so with that, I just want to point out too, there are a few words floating around on the screens behind you that you may see or may not, that will come up and people may try and address them, and we'll see where that really is going to take us. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it back over to Aruna and Norman, and they can tell us a bit about what they're thinking, and hopefully we'll enter into an open dialogue. I know it's going to be hot in here for 2 hours, but see how we can do it. And I know people have to come and go as well, so feel free to, don't feel embarrassed. Just get up and have to go to class, and that's fine. I'm sure we have some people coming in late as well. So thank you all for coming, and I'm going to turn it over to Norm and Aruna. Would you like to go first, John?
No. First of all, creating a space for dialogue in the academy is essential. And how does dialogue begin? I believe not with the answers, but with the questions. And so I'd ask you right now and invite you that we begin this dialogue with your questions, where you're at. And that the only principle that we have is this. The only wrong question is the unasked question. So let's begin with your questions. Some of you have seen the film. Some of you know the work of the people here. Woody Allen made a film, anything you always want to know about sex but never dared ask. Well, this is the time, anything you ever wanted to know about radical pedagogy but never dare ask. Now's the time. Yes, thank you.
I was kind of hard. I really enjoyed the film, first of all, let me say, and thank you for coming and for organizing this. My question is about how to balance my feeling of responsibility to teach, the subject matter, with making students really live. I teach philosophy, so I want them to live philosophy. And that's where I find it most difficult to balance a commitment to the received views and to pedagogy and having students come out of my class knowing what they should know with thinking outside of the box and doing what relatively radical things in my field. So how did you, I guess maybe to personalize it, how did you make the decision to be radical as you did?
I can answer that. First of all, I didn't make the decision. It was quite a long and arduous process,
okay.
and I would say it's still ongoing. I've been teaching for 23, 24 years. And even when I was a graduate student, I was evolving some of my own ideas about teaching, but not in a vacuum, always because I was inspired by other teachers and by my own experience. One of the words that we have up there, we were brainstorming some words that we thought, if this had been a longer time in a workshop, we would have asked people to reflect on a word in relationship to their philosophy of teaching. One of the words is content, and it's floating around up there along with, now I'm getting old enough I can't read that far. Radical, transformation, creativity may be up there, and I think for me the hardest thing to let go of, and it took me years, and occasionally I call it, I think it's regression. The Bell Hooks calls this notion that we have to cover a certain amount of material, the tyranny of content. And the tyranny of content is hard because we're in an institution where we feel like we have to cover a syllabus. We're often asked to provide a syllabus. Students expect it, our colleagues expect it of us. I make no secret of the fact in other places, like here at TRU, that I actually don't create syllabi anymore. But I don't tell my colleagues, unless they ask.
Right.
And one of the reasons for that is as soon as I've created a syllabus, I have made a curriculum that my students don't have any input into, and that sets up certain expectations. What are we going to read next week? I teach in English and Indigenous Studies. And by saying I'm not going to set a syllabus in place, then I commit myself to the process of what's going on in the classroom. Unlearning knowledge, learning knowledge, creativity, all of those kinds of things. If I had a syllabus, I know that inside I would think it's October the 31st, and we have not covered this text yet, or this idea, or this concept. Internalize the content. I also feel that we need to know why we teach. We have to have a sense of what our relationship to teaching and learning is, so that when we come up with the colleague who says you're a bit flaky, you haven't covered Hegel yet, you have a response. No, I haven't covered Hegel, but this is what I think is important to cover.
But following up, I should have chose the title for this dialogue, Radical Pedagogies, and it sort of took me aback. And I think, what's radical? Well, first of all, in speaking with this lady who is a teacher, I think maybe it's radical to say in a postmodern world that teaching isn't a job. It's not just a career. Teaching is a calling. It's a vocation. And so this means it engages every fiber of our being. And when we start parsing out the content from the calling, I believe we create what I would call a false dichotomy. What's radical? I believe the content is the student as content. Now here, since you're in philosophy, who informs me? Gabriel Marcel. And the philosophy of personalism, the French school between the two world wars, a Catholic scholar, and he believes, since you're a philosopher, epistemologically, all knowledge ultimately is personal. So how do we personalize the content? How does it relate to their lived experience? What I term reality-based education.
Gail, you had something.
Kind of got some of the answers to my question. I was going to ask, what was your definition of a radical pedagogy? Now, I've been a teacher for 30 years, and a lot of maybe what you do, I actually just call that learning activities. It was pedagogy. I taught science, but I used to use, for example, the arts in science. I've taken the kids outside and on the grass, on the lawn, to dance as atoms, and from what I'm seeing, that. But I just thought, I'm just trying to be creative in my work. As an instructional designer now, we call what you're saying authentic-based learning, problem-solving learning, multimodal learning, learning to the different senses and learning styles. So I'm still kind of trying to grapple, well, where's the line? At what point does your pedagogy become radical? What do you guys think makes a pedagogy radical? I just see that as non-traditional teaching, not stand up and lecture. But nowadays, people are moving already to using technology, using social media, is that all radical pedagogy?
I think what's radical about it, relating to the first question too, is that when teaching becomes a moral and ethical imperative, as you see in Alani Sobamsuan's film, over the course of my 15 years of teaching, I saw people drowning, not literally drowning, psychologically, emotionally, intellectually. If someone's drowning right in front of you, you throw them a lifesaver. We cannot divorce the reality of their experience from our curriculum. But maybe it's radical to say, because it's a calling, because it's a vocation, that I have a moral and ethical responsibility, not just to communicate content, but to meet what psychologists call felt needs. Which brings up the question of the affective dimension in education. In post-Enlightenment frame of reference, we're communicating data, you master the data, and you move on to the next step. But what did Augustine say, the ancient philosopher? The heart has reasons which reason does not know. How do we respond to the reasons that they themselves don't know? I believe it's by creating a space in the university classroom where they can explore that unsaid, inarticulated dimension, which is part of their lived experience. And here, of course, if we learned anything from Freud and from Jung, we know that much of our life, our mental life, hence intellectual life, takes place subconsciously, unconsciously. This is a treasure trove that we could mine, that we could draw on. It behooves us to do so, because when the student walks in the classroom, they're not just bringing their brain. They're bringing their sexuality, they're bringing their identity, they're having a bad hair day. All of this informs the classroom experience. So it's incumbent upon us to see the big picture of education rather than taking a reductionistic approach where education comes down to here's the data, master the data, repeat the data.
And my response to the notion of radicalness is an ambivalent one, because my feeling after a long career, and I think a fairly privileged career as a university educator, is that the possibilities of being truly radical and truly transformative, and I connect transformative education with radical education and pedagogy. If I am here for myself to be transformed and for people in my class to be transformed by the learning experience, that to me is radical. But is the university a place where that can happen? And that to me has always been an open question. So we've associated all these words, like the notion of the radical, to transformation, to risk. I think innovative teaching is a different thing from radical teaching. I've tried a lot of innovations, realized that I've innovated without any sense of how it connects to my pedagogical philosophy or to my own self and sense of identity. Sometimes it works. You know, students have fun, that's great. But it's not radical. It's not a transformative experience for anyone. We have a bit of fun in the classroom, I would say. Sometimes they hate it. And I can't then articulate for a student why it is that I are often saying we're going to be engaged in this process. So I think the radicalness comes in with a lot of self-examination and self-reflection and self-critique. And with acknowledging that often we fail, that we're there to learn as well. And I think for instructors, it's very hard to remember that we're learners too in the classroom.
I'm a chemistry prof, and my way of understanding the radical part, or as close as I could approach to it, is to at least try to provide an environment in which I'm engaging them, in which I'm not just spoon-feeding the content, but I'm trying to get the content from them, from what they already know. But then the implications when you teach science is a little bit different when you're teaching other subjects where you can reach spiritual parts and other aspects of their education that will be more into the arts section of things. So I wonder how else this could be done from a science perspective, how you can transform. Because sometimes the students are willing and seeking that, but most of the time we might say they sit there as passively as they could if you lead them by that. And sometimes some of them might not really want to be challenged too much. I mean, if this is too complicated, why just make it simpler and that's it? I just want to get what I have to do to get my grade and go. So how in science you can approach the radicalness will be the question.
Well, you've got a lot in there. You know, they just want to get their grade and they want to move on and they don't want to be challenged. But why are they here? I mean, what I set out at the very beginning of the semester is this is the university version of boot camp and survival, because that's what life is. So here are the terms. If you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen. And if they can leave our course unscathed, we haven't done our job. What we're there to do is to challenge them. We exist to question their presuppositions, not simply about our discipline, but about the human condition. Now, as a historian, in speaking of the sciences, first of all, I feel not knowing the sciences, I'm atrophied. I really believe that. So one of my goals has been, for 20 years now, because the dialogic sessions that you see in the film have continued ever since, non-stop. How do we establish a dialogue between the arts and the sciences? Sometimes we have the impression that never the twain shall meet. I believe that is, again, a post-Enlightenment false dichotomy. When I look at artists such as Da Vinci, they're conducting experiments in science just as they are in the arts, in their studio. And I happen to be also an art critic, so I write catalogs for art exhibits and museums and the like. And when I go into an artist studio, I get exactly the same vibe as a scientist lab. It's as though both are engaged in problem solving. They set themselves a problem, and through trial and error, they endeavor to solve that problem. So I believe there are actually some, philosophers would call it, first principles that inform both the arts and the sciences. As a historian too, what I would want to communicate to my students in the sciences are those scientific epiphanies. Take, for example, Albert Einstein. We all associate him with the theory of relativity, and we're thinking, oh, he must have been slaving away in the lab to come up with that solution. In actual fact, the theory came to him while he was riding the streetcar in Zurich, and he saw masses moving, the streetcars moving, and that served, since we're in the history of science, that was the paradigm shift for him. Masses and movement. So I would approach them from the aspect of those moments of epiphany. At the same time, what's also common between the humanities and the sciences is discipline. Nobody makes it without blood, sweat, and tears. So the idea that you can be creative without discipline, to me, that's BS. I work a lot with artists. I've had the privilege of receiving over 30 winners of the Governor General's Awards in the arts. And I'm talking literature, film, and the like. They are some of the hardest working people I've ever had the privilege of meeting. So I think we want to set the foundation here. Look at, there's no free ride for anybody. But discipline itself isn't enough. How do we cultivate the imagination, creativity? Dr. Ivar Mendez is one of the dialogue partners that I regularly invite. He's one of the world's foremost neuroscientists. I encourage all of you to just Google Dr. Ivar Mendez. There's more written on him than all of us combined can read. And he happens also to be a sculptor and a painter. And when I saw his work in an international exhibition, and I never read the names of the works, the medium, or anything like that. The art has got to stand or fall on its own. But at the end of the exhibition, I said, boy, I've got to meet this artist. So I went to the curator and I said, could you introduce me to the artist or put me in contact with the artist? And they said, well, the artist is a neuroscientist. I said, wait a minute, are we talking about the same person here? And then I realized, because I contacted him in person, he says, Professor Cornett, I need creativity before I go into the OR. He says, all the breakthroughs in science depended on people taking risks in their research and that creative, that epiphany moment. So I would bring these into the full package of teaching the sciences. I think they're all part of it. Anyway.
And my response to that is a bit like the content question, is that we're in a situation in the university where we've inherited, and this applies to high school education to a lesser extent, this applies even to elementary school as well, that we've inherited this notion of the discipline. I mean, the discipline, whether it's chemistry, biology, whether it's fine arts, whether it's philosophy. And each of us has a particular academic culture in which we're particularly invested in that, even if we work in interdisciplinary context. And that's where the content issue comes in. So my students will often ask me that question. I teach in the arts and humanities, but they still want to know, well, where is the stuff? Where is it the material that we're learning? And so I ask them to do the work of researching the institutions in North America where there are no content-based courses, because they exist. And they exist in the sciences, and they exist in medicine, and they exist in law, and they exist in every discipline. But we don't necessarily know about those, the universities where there's no grading in that. We think that these are essentials. So the story I want to tell is not about myself, it's about my father, who's an engineer, a retired administrator at UBC. He was VP of Student and Academic Services for many years. And I didn't know this till I started talking to him about teaching, that he for many, many years had been trying to innovate engineering, electrical engineering programs, so that they were not course-based. From first year to, and this is not really that revolutionary, but for UBC it was. And he had to go through all the, the committee work that you do, trying essentially to convince his colleagues that you do not need foundational courses in engineering for students to get an engineering degree. For many of us,
that sounds radical.
well, they exist all over the world. My father's point was, if you can have medical schools that don't have foundational courses, if you can have humanities programs, if you can have engineering programs elsewhere, why couldn't UBC have a 4-year engineering program that did not have, that was basically a problem-based curriculum? Lots of independent learning, collaborative learning, maybe not transformative or radical in the sense that I often think of, but definitely the resistance he got was incredible. And I think he actually was not successful in the end. But many of UBC's international programs now have this engineering degree. So we'd have these long and quite intensely emotional discussions because he felt as a scientist and an engineer that integrating the arts and humanities and so forth into a science education, it's an old liberal humanist idea, was critical, and that the engineers were coming out of engineering school without any practical knowledge of how to pass their engineering exam, what buildings looked like if there were civil engineers, what wiring looked like if there were electrical engineers, because they were all taking these courses. So they passed the courses, they did well on exams, but when the professional, not Council of Engineers, whatever it is, the professional engineering.
The order?
The
order of engineering?
It's not an order. They got a professional engineering degree. The people in BC and Alberta and across the country who accredit engineers are saying your students are coming out without any knowledge of how actually to be an engineer. And that is something that the schools have to fix. It's not our job as a profession to fix that. And that was what motivated my dad. It was a practical issue. How do we make better engineers? But the resistance was incredible. I have colleagues in English who feel students have to have Shakespeare at the first year level or they're not going to succeed in life. Literally.
Or maybe not in love.
A corollary to that, we were talking about this yesterday, is that it's often hard to see from our own disciplines, how we can do stuff in our own disciplines, and Jenny mentioned that, and you were talking about that too. One example I had was when I was teaching at Emily Carr, and I was mentioning this to Brian a bit too, where we were trying to institute modes of technology. And the first thing that would happen was people would say, well, that would work for you and what you teach, but not for what I teach, right? And so it can often be very difficult to see in a kind of myopic way how as Aruna is suggesting, how we can do things that seem to be radical from a disciplinary notion. You can see it happening elsewhere, and it seems it can work there, but how does it work for us? And that's, I think, the challenge. How do you actually get things to work within those disciplines? And the other corollary to the corollaries is something we were talking about yesterday. I would be thinking a lot about, and I know Aruna's been doing a lot of this too, is looking at different worldviews around education. And what I've been studying a lot now are indigenous ways of knowledge. My very first teaching experiences were on the 6th generation teaching English. And I realized that what works, or what seems to work in what we're taught works as an educational model, doesn't always work for all communities. So thinking through different worldviews and different possibilities, and as Norma mentioned, what the student brings in, of course, is equally and perhaps more important than anything else that we can bring into that space. But anyway, I just wanted to run that out there.
Can I actually say one more?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'll try and be quiet after this. Another example, and this is where my thinking around cross-disciplinary teaching really radicalized, was only a few years ago. For a short while, University of Calgary had a very well-known problem-based teacher in faculty of medicine. He's gone back to McMaster and discussed after the experience at UC. And he and I taught a course together. He's a pharmacologist, so he teaches in the faculty of medicine at McMaster. He never teaches courses that are content-based specifically. He doesn't teach pharmacology 101 or whatever it is that people in medicine might take. So what he and I taught was a course that was for Bachelor of Health Sciences and pre-med students, as well as any other student who wanted to take it. And it was called How to Poison People. And it was listed as an arts course as well as a medicine course, so the students, all the registration stuff would work out. And what the students had to do is they had to get a great, strong grounding in pharmacology. That was their independent learning. So you had English students in there who'd never taken a science course. And Dr. Rangachari said, I don't care if you've never taken a science course. You're taking a course in pharmacology. You have to figure out how you're going to poison people. So we did detective novels. They wrote creative work. And I learned more about pharmacology in that one term of teaching with Chari, because I had to keep on top of my science, because the students had to do it. You know, I thought, well, if they're being asked to do this, PowerPoint presentations on the science behind a particular poison. And so for him, his sense was that anyone can be asked to do anything because we have the information at our disposal. What we have to teach students or mentor is the knowledge retrieval process and processing. What was interesting was the pharmacology students, or the medicine students rather, were way better at the creative process in the end. They did great creative projects. The art students did better in the science. And that was fascinating. And he said he wasn't surprised. He'd been doing this for 30 years. He said that often happens because you work harder in the area that you think you're not going to do well in. For me, that was the proof that we didn't need that sort of disciplinary background to succeed in a course that we did. And that creativity was critical to the process of learning.
Now, I'm going to age myself here and also tell you that I did my early work at UC Berkeley when things were really moving at Berkeley, and they had love-ins. I guess we could call this a learn-in, and I notice we have people standing, so please come to our learn-in and sit down here and make yourself comfortable. Come on, folks. This is we invite you. There's an empty chair. We got room here. I think this relates to the question about chemistry. What if we approach chemistry through the prism of the detective novel? You know, this is part of...
I don't know if I would teach my third-year class that way, and what it's going to get at the end of their... I don't know. I mean,
but yeah. I mean, isn't it Kuhn, the historian of sciences, who brings us to the notion of paradigm shifts? So I think this is very interesting what Aruna has just said, that by taking what seems an oblique way to pharmacology, you actually end up at the very heart of content of the curriculum. If you employ a different lens and perceive the discipline through another mode. I also would like to say, for me, one of the biggest issues on the university campus is freedom. Academic freedom, freedom of expression, and the professor giving the students freedom and themselves exercising academic freedom and freedom of expression. Why do I say this, and particularly in relationship to the sciences? For me, the university classroom is a laboratory, and I'm conducting experiments in pedagogy. I'm trying to find out what works. How could it work better? What doesn't work and fails miserably? Could we give ourselves the freedom to conduct experiments in education? Always in the back of my mind is, how do we learn? How could we learn better? In other words, how does cognitive acquisition take place? To me, these are the first principles of education. That being said, there are hands up, so let's go to some hands.
Hearing what you have to say and listening, talking to my spouse about the movie last night, I completely agree with you. I think your process should be put in place, but here's the reality. I worked in 3 or 4 different institutions in Canada and the United States, and we're a long way from the culture of UC Berkeley. The world has changed.
Fair
Administrations are going more and more towards finding ways to measure outcomes of students.
Yes, yes,
and they're
yes.
standardizing things, and the young assistant professor, he has no freedom
Yes.
of the academy any longer.
Yes,
We will not get tenure if we do not give a syllabus, if we do not get certain number of students through that class. And we're watching ourselves as teachers trying to become better teachers, watching that be completely eroded by things like online education, where a teacher, I think here they have an online program where they get an expert to build a class, and then the expert is fired, and then a mentor is brought in to just kind of negotiate the students through this class. And it's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard of in my life. How do we as young assistant professors who want to get tenure even begin to be allowed to do that with no academic freedom? This is what troubles me about that. Because
that's
I believe
right on.
in students. I want to help my students, each and every one of them. I worked in a small institution in the American South in South Carolina. I had 80% African American students. They could barely read and write. And I knew that I couldn't teach what I was supposed to teach them. I had to first teach them how to read and write and explain to me and articulate their worldview. And I couldn't do it when I was being told, your students have to pass this test at the end of the semester, and if they don't, then you're going to get a very bad teaching evaluation and you'll lose your job. And that's not just the way it's going in the U.S. It's also coming to that way in Canada too. I know there are forces at work to try to make people be able to teach a gamut of courses that everyone's supposed to be able to teach, even though they don't have the knowledge. So I'm wondering, how in the world do we do what you want to say when there are administrations who are smothering creativity? That's my
Well, Runa wrote something recently on the site that addresses this. So we'll first begin with Runa responding.
Are we getting into the cynicism? I only have provisional responses to that because I think you're right that your particular individual situation, you have to measure what you can do, what risks you're taking. I felt the same way, and the situations were the same when I was assistant professor. We were told we wouldn't get tenure if we didn't do certain things. So what I had to do at that time, before I had tenure, was, and this is when I was reading works of people like bell hooks, and started to read in critical pedagogy. And again, I'm not as much of a bell hooks fan now as I used to be, but at that time she was extraordinarily influential in my thinking. And one of the things that she said was, first of all, there are elements of risk and comfort that every sense of risk feels real. And she was also talking about the classroom context, where students say they don't feel safe in your classroom. And she said we have to distinguish between a false sense of discomfort or lack of safety and a real sense. Norman lost his job because of what he did. I experienced real negative feedback, if you like, and I've experienced and suffered certain things in my career because of the way I teach. But I'm committed to that teaching, and I still have a job. As someone was recently talking about being able to retire, be a subversive teacher and still be able to retire without the institution finding out. My institution knows the way I teach to a certain extent, but no one has come into my classroom. So what Hook says is we need to critique ourselves and say, what are the real discomforts? Am I going to get fired? Or do I think I'm going to get fired, for one thing? The other is, how does this relate to that student body? Is my commitment enough? And this is one of the questions I had to ask, because when I was at UBC, people kept saying, you cannot teach this way, wait till you've got tenure. Wait till you've got tenure. You get tenure, and they say, wait till you're promoted. And so it keeps going. Wait until this, wait until that. And at some point, I did say, it was a conscious choice, to say, I am not going to wait any longer to do the work that's really important. And materially it will have an effect, and certainly psychologically it has an effect. The risks I've taken have had an extraordinary psychological toll on me personally. But I have a job. And if I hadn't taught the way that I do, I think I would be a different person that I don't like very much. And I now know that I'm at a point in my career where if I cannot change at least my small part of the institution, and I'm focusing on Indigenous studies, then I have to leave it. I have to voluntarily leave it and say it doesn't matter that I earn this extraordinarily gross kind of salary that I don't deserve in some ways. I have to leave because teaching is the